Hello, you're watching TVP World Talks. I'm Jonasz Rewiński. The Warsaw Uprising of 1944 remains a crucial moment in Poland's history and a major point of reference for the nation's identity. Yet as we examine its legacy, it is impossible not to look to the present day as well, to the questions of historical justice, but also to how similar scenes of violence, heroism and resistance are playing out in neighboring Ukraine. Joining us now to look at the impact of the uprising and at the region's security environment today is Władysław Teofil Bartoszewski, Poland's Deputy Foreign Minister. Hello and welcome to TVP World.
Hello, good afternoon.
Glad to have you here with us today. And my first question is going to be, well, from a perspective of any foreign viewer watching this program, how would you describe the impact of the Warsaw Uprising today to someone who has not grown within the Polish culture and who might not be familiar with the history of that particular event?
The event, the Polish Uprising, of course, in terms of military significance in the Second World War, was very minor. However, it had a big political consequence even then, and a huge consequence for Polish history and Polish psyche. Politically, it was important because it was the largest uprising in occupied Europe during the Second World War. It lasted 63 days and about 170,000 civilians were killed and about 15,000 fighting home army soldiers, give or take. But it was a situation where everybody accepted the German Nazis were the enemy. But the United States and England had the allies in the Soviet Union of Joseph Stalin. And Joseph Stalin had decided that Eastern Europe should be, by then it was after the Tehran conference, and everybody knew that Eastern Europe will be under Soviet control. But it was still dreamt that it could be democratic. And when the uprising started, Soviet forces were quite close to Warsaw. They were stopped briefly by the counteroffensive of Field Marshal Model, but then they decided not to proceed. And what started big problems between the Allies is that the Russians would not allow American or British or South African planes to land after dropping supplies on the besieged Warsaw, to land on the Soviet-occupied territory, which enraged especially Churchill, who correctly figured out that this is actually going to be a beginning of a new phase, which was known as the Cold War later. So that was a big issue of contention between especially the British, to less extent the Americans and the Soviets. So it did play a role because it proved that Soviets have designs on these territories which were not what they theoretically agreed during the Tehran and later, of course, Yalta, but that was before Yalta. So there was an impact for the Poles. It was an effort which united all political parties, from communists to extreme nationalists, who decided that we are going to fight against the occupying forces who completely destroyed our country.
And the legacy of this uprising actually
losses in people.
The legacy of this uprising lived on during the communist era, even though the communist government didn't really look kindly upon the memory of the uprising and what it signified for Poland as a nation, right?
The issue was that the people who fought in the uprising, they fought for independent, democratic Poland, and free of and sovereign Poland, not occupied by the Soviets, as it was till 1989. after the war. And of course, there was never a mention of the fact that the Soviet army could have come to help the uprising, but decided for political reasons not to. And so people who fought in the uprising ended up in prisons. My father was sentenced to 8 years in jail because he was a soldier in the uprising. And these people were hated by the communists, but that united the rest of the nation. The communists were a minority. During the uprising, there was even a communist fighters, and afterwards, one of them wrote a book with a very telling title, "We Were 100." Yes, but that's just about right. Out of tens of thousands of people who fought, there were maybe a few hundred communists.
So effectively, the legacy of the uprising lives on today, but also the events of World War II continue to cast a long shadow on the relations between countries nowadays. Now, can you tell us about how this impacts the way that Poland and Germany coexist today? Because as members of the European Union, our countries cooperate, but there has been the question of war reparations. It has appeared in the political discourse in Poland, and it appears to have been accepted to a lesser or greater extent that this issue still has not been resolved.
That's correct. A few years ago, the Polish parliament made a resolution asking the Germans not for reparations, because that's a formal legal term, and no court will judge such a claim, because no court in the world will judge such a claim now. But for a form of compensation, because Germans says they are morally guilty. They admit they are morally guilty for the total destruction of the city, not to mention the rest of the country. And since you say we are morally guilty, there should be some form of moral, but also then financial compensation. You atone for your sins somehow. And that is an issue which is raised in every political meeting between the Polish and German politicians, between the presidents, between the prime ministers, between foreign ministers. And this topic is not going away, because the public in Poland feel that we have never been compensated for the total destruction of our city and of our country. So, but we don't demand reparation. But this is an ethical issue, and this is how this is now treated in Germany. Very often from the bottom up. Normal people says, well, actually, we did horrible things, which is normally acknowledged. Today, on the German embassy, a German flag flies at half-mast to commemorate the evil they did here in August, September 1944. If you admit that, some form of compensation is expected.
So gradually, the nations that fought during World War II are agreeing upon the very fundamentals, right? The fundamentals of guilt, responsibility, and justice. But meanwhile, we also have a very dark spectacle playing out before our eyes in Ukraine. Russia continuing to attack Ukraine. And now we've had a very important, very interesting update from Poland's Prime Minister Donald Tusk recently, who said that according to many signals that he has received, there could be a ceasefire taking place soon. Can you perhaps provide us with some more details on that?
There's lots of talk about a possibility of some form of ceasefire, but the problem is that the Russians and President Putin do not want a ceasefire. President Putin wants to occupy the entire country of Ukraine, so it's not a sovereign independent state. And we will never agree to that, and neither will, of course, the Ukrainians. At the moment, there are various possibilities, including increased sanctions by America, which President Trump has been mentioning, the so-called secondary sanctions, which penalizing anybody in the world who buys Russian oil and gas. So we'll see what will happen. No, we do not believe. We believe that Putin's Russia is a neo-colonial imperialistic state which wants to turn the clock back remove countries which joined NATO in the 90s, including Poland, the Baltic states, Czechoslovakia, now Czechia and Slovakia and Hungary and Romania, remove them from the Western sphere of influence, as he would call it, and wants them to be subservient to imperial Russia. That will never happen.
Now, there have been recent signals from top NATO generals and also from the Polish government suggesting that a scenario whereby China and Russia collude to essentially create a very dangerous environment on a global scale, perhaps, that this scenario is within the realm of possibility. How does this current situation what does the current situation tell us about the security environment in our region, and what can be done to avert any possible threats?
It's a fairly obvious, because there would be no war in Ukraine if China didn't help Russia politically, and but also by using dual-use components for the weapons which they supply, and economically. So the situation is very serious, and that was what you mentioned. There was an interview given by Sasser, the American general in command of forces in Europe, and he said we may have a war in Russia within 2 years, combined with some form of problems around South China Sea. The only way to react to that is to prepare. We are spending almost 5% of GDP on defense. We have now a third largest army in NATO after the US and Turkey. We are buying American arms for the sum of roughly $60 billion, and we are going to have in few years 1,000 tanks. We have persuaded our friends and allies in NATO to accept the demands of President Trump to spend 5% of their GDP annually on defense. And we are creating a strong northeastern flank of NATO to be ready, because we, as the American general said, we may have to face a Russian invasion in about 2 years' time. And the only way to stop it is to have a deterrent. That means have enough forces ready to fight to stop the aggressor by showing him that the cost of such a move would be too high.
And how should ordinary members of the public interpret these warnings? Some people, upon hearing that, have interpreted them as something of a virtual certainty. And obviously, we're talking about the various possibilities, including such against which we have to enhance our deterrence. But what would you say to people who have been distraught or disturbed by those very signals, which after all came from both the government and from high-ranking officials within NATO itself?
Well, you cannot object to reality. Reality is what it is. We are facing a Russian threat. The Ukrainians are facing a brutal war waged against civilians. There used to be a NATO strategy that if an invader comes to our borders, we may withdraw and then regain the territory temporarily occupied by that invader. Having seen what the Russian soldiers did around Kiev, in Bucha, Irpin, in other places, namely within a few weeks which they spent there murdering masses of civilians, we said, no, we are not going to give an inch of our territory. We don't want to then discover murdered women, children, and the elderly. No, we are not going to let them cross. In other words, we have to be prepared. If you are prepared, the Russians will think twice. There's one country which it's not very likely to be attacked by Russia should they move against NATO, and that is Finland. And why is that? Because Finland is exceptionally well prepared. Their civil defense is extremely good. The internal cohesion, the level of preparedness for a nation of 6 million people, they are able to have 900,000 soldiers in reserves to go and fight. And Russia is certainly not going to choose Finland as its first point of attack because they have a bad experience from the war in 1939-1940, where in 105 days, that's how long it lasted, the Russian casualty figure was 100,000 soldiers. So I don't think if you are prepared, you are safe. If you are having illusions that nothing will happen, you may be in danger.
Władysław Teofil Bartoszewski was our guest today here on TVP World. Thank you very much for joining us and for sharing your insight.
Thank you very much.
And I'm Jonasz Rewiński. You're watching TVP World. Please stay with us for more latest news and updates.